Welcome back to this quick and effective environment illustration course. In this lesson, we're going to keep on coloring and texturing using our refined layer shapes that we've locked down earlier. We're going to move to the foreground and we're going to cast the light on these trees. So I've got that foreground layer and I've created a new layer to drop into that foreground layer as a clipping mask. And I'm painting on that layer freely and loosely, and I'm only going to see what shows up in the mask of the layer below. And I'm just going to pick the light color, this intense orange from the setting sun, and slowly build up a texture and a feel of how this tree is getting lit. I have that reference image, but if I was to zoom in and look at that image, I'd just get lost in all the detail that you'd see here. You know, for every brush stroke I put down here, there's hundreds of pine needles. You know, that's what I'm representing. And I've got to build up to that by using a sparsely textured brush, you know, keeping the opacity down at first and continually erasing out the pockets, you know, in between where the bunches of needles are. And so that's the technique I'm going to use to slowly build up a convincing light on this pine tree. And it's going to it takes a little while. It takes some slow work and a lot of back and forth of putting it in, carving it out. But as you develop the techniques to paint the things you're painting, you know, whether it's a tree, whether it's an ice landscape or a desert scene, or even the waves of the ocean, you do studies and you develop a technique to paint those things. And the more you do it, the better you get. And that's really the secret to improving, the secret to learning new skills and new techniques. Really the hands-on work, the actual producing a new piece, doing a study of something you haven't studied before. That's where you really get results in growing as an artist. And here in the foreground, if you squint down now, you see that the colors I'm putting in, the textures I'm putting in, they stand out even if you squint, because this is the light. This is the light layer I'm putting in over this foreground. And since it's so close to the viewer, I can use a lot more definition, a lot more contrast in the colors and in the edges. There's a lot more refinement going on in the foreground. Where if you just think about this tree and those marks to the left of this tree in the background, those are representing trees, if not groupings of trees. And you know, that vast difference between a tree being represented by one simple brushstroke in the middle ground and a tree in the foreground being represented, well, not, you just have to paint the tree in the foreground. You know, that's key to showing depth, because if you were to just take this tree, for example, cut it out, copy paste it, transform it down, and paste them along this background ridge, it wouldn't work out. It wouldn't, even if you adjusted the colors and the values right, then you'd be stuck with all this detail and all this definition of this crisp edges. When you shrink that down, it maintains that crispness, and it doesn't look like a tree from far away. It looks like a tree from close up shrunk down. And that's something when doing this environment work, when doing landscape painting, it's different than figure work where you're not simply painting the object and painting it in different places. You know, I'm not painting a tree here and in there and in the background. You know, you've got to think about it differently. Think about it in this way where you're painting the impression of a tree. You're painting what the object looks like under certain conditions. And that's really the main difference in mindset when doing landscape work versus figure work, where in figure work, it's more about the form. It's more about representing this figure. But once you get into the landscape, you know, the entire canvas is the focus. The entire canvas is the figure, and within that you're representing elements. You can start to think about it a whole lot, and you can get lost in the theory of it. But sometimes when you've got a long stretch ahead of you of work to do like this, your mind can start to wander and think about the theory. You know, because in painting these trees, it's just using this technique and slowly building it up. And always keeping in mind that you're slowly working up to the impression of it. Like with this indication of the trunk, it's really a loose line, a loose edge, soft edged, and then there's going to be a little bit lighter in the middle, a little lighter color in the middle, but it's still not, you know, this is far enough back in the picture that you're not quite worried about the form lighting, about rounding out this trunk shape yet. This foreground trunk overlapping these trees, that's close enough in the foreground where I'm going to need to think about rounding it out and maybe even bounce light from below and the ambient light from the sky from above. But in these distant trees, you know, I'm saying distant trees, but remember there's still the trees behind and you know, the distance goes back infinitely. But these distant trees, you know, I've got to treat them with the technique appropriate to how far they are from the camera or from the viewer. So the colors I'm putting in now are not in the light world. They're not the direct light colors. All the colors going into the rest of the foreground are basically going to be bounce light colors. Just the ambient color from the sky. So that's going to wrap up this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll get going on coloring and texturing that foreground tree.